Hello and welcome to my little workshop podcasting from script to stream. My name is Matt Richards and thank you for joining me. I hope you'll get some really useful information out of this workshop ahead. So we'll jump straight on into it. Just to kick it off, my name is Matt Richards. I'm a professional learning specialist for Apple, and a few of my little personal details here. I hail from Adelaide, the third most livable city in the world. Just note that one. And a few of my contact details should you wish to reach out. As I said, this little workshop is called Podcasting with GarageBand from Script to Stream. And the reason why the word stream simply is because we spend a lot of our time looking at how we can script and how we can even record in GarageBand, but the streaming part is a little bit of a mystery. So we'll get to that later and hopefully you'll get some ideas out of it. It isn't the easiest thing, and I will preface by saying that there is a bit of work to be done there. However, it is achievable, and this hopefully will just point you in starting in some of the right directions. So let's kick off with a few statistics first. These are from 2019 based in Australia. 30% of Australians were actively listening to a podcast. And if we were to break those 30% down, we'd see that there's some variety. 82 at home, 43% in a car, 18% while on foot. 13% is an interesting one, 13% at work, 12% on public transport and 7% at the gym. What is particularly interesting, and this really speaks to engagement, is that 54% of people complete a podcast series. So it tells us that many people will start, but they don't always quite get to the end. 89% of people who are 12 or over who own a phone, of which most of the podcasting is listened to on. So 75% listening to podcasts on their phone. And finally, within Australia, we rank 4th in the global listening rates. Apple Podcasts themselves have over 500,000 active podcasts. So when we think about scale and variety and what we can reach and people we can reach, it's very, very active and a good platform to put our material on. This workshop is going to be broken up into 3 parts: planning and preparation, recording and what I call digital mechanics, and finally publishing. So we'll kick off straight with number 1. With planning and preparation. Now, ordinarily, if it wasn't pre-recorded, I'd be asking a bunch of questions, podcasts you might know of, genres or topics, and so on. But if I was to really focus on one question, I'd say, what is the appeal of the podcast medium? And more often than not, the answer to that question is simply because of multitasking. I can do 2 things at once. I can be driving and listen to a podcast, on a plane, listen to a podcast, even cleaning or doing the dishes and listening to a podcast. And I suppose unlike YouTube, where you are fixed to a screen to watch, generally, podcast is all about listening. So it makes it a little bit more accessible. So when we talk about different types of podcasts, we can break it down into 3. We have the solo podcast. We can say we have the co-host or shared podcast. And finally, we have the interview. And traditionally in a school setting, we might focus on the co-host or shared podcast. If we think about how we gather our students together, working them in teams and working together to create a shared product. However, sometimes the interview podcast can be really valuable if you want to engage people outside of the classroom. So based on those 3 though, is where you might start your direction. We then have a look at how we can then start breaking down the parts of the podcast. Now, I've broken it up into 5 areas. The first being an intro and a welcome, how we introduce ourselves, speakers, any guests. What we're going to be covering is number 2. But number 3 is kind of the real guts of the whole podcast. That's where all the discussion and the conversation happens, those discussion points. Number 4, a little bit of a conclusion or a wrap up. And finally, in number 5, it might be a sign off. You might have a tagline or something you want to sort of round out or end your podcast with. So how do we plan it? Now, planning is a really interesting step because there are 2 ways you can approach this. You can either plan to speak freely or plan to script. And I guess at the end of the day, the choice is yours. However, at the very beginning, I suppose all planning, I think, starts really well with a Lotus diagram. So I've broken down a Lotus diagram into different topics and I started with 4. You can always take it further and you don't even need to do all 4. But if we took a topic and we broke down how we could speak, and all the ideas and the speaking points go in the circles. So If I was to sit in front of my microphone or with a partner and I was going to be preparing or recording a podcast, I would just speak to what's in the circles. It allows the podcast to sound natural and flow quite easily, and I've got the information in front of me to speak to. Hopefully I know the content enough to be able to speak to those points. However, if you wanted to script it, well, there's your Lotus diagram for planning for scripting. So you can effectively write your script out. So that planning document is probably the first part. Second to that is what I call the run sheet. So it's just a really clear map of what happens in sequential order. Those two files do sit on my website. So if you need to access them, you can just jump on the resources section of my website and you can find them. Okay, so a little bit further on, we're going to think about how we can prepare a podcast visually. So even before we do any of the recording, we're going to talk a little bit about artwork. So artwork is a really key thing. We need to be able to be engaging and capture the imagination of the listener. Imagine if you are opening up podcasts on or Apple Podcasts and you want to, see straight away an idea of what the podcast is going to be like. This is where we would start with the artwork. So some really key points with artwork is that they are simple. And if you look at the three examples here, are just examples I've mucked around with students and myself in the past. The one on the right was done as a little competition within some year 3-4 students. But we get the idea that they're simple, that the background is either a solid or a subtle gradient. Students will tend to want to use gradients too much. So they go really heavy on the rainbow colors, and I tend to try and pull that back. And the best example is in the first and second one, where the blues go from light blue to dark blue, or the gray is light gray to dark gray on the edge, radial. So by doing that, it's just simple and subtle. For those that are familiar with Pages, Keynote, or even Numbers, the term Instant Alpha will be familiar to you, where you can remove backgrounds. And so by having a person on there as well, taken against a solid color like a green screen or similar, will allow you to have that person stand out on the screen. And finally, your type should be nice, big and bold. So it's something that's really eye-catching and you can see it straight away. So how do we make some artwork? And that's where we're going to kick off. We're going to start that together. And to kick that off, we're going to use our iPad. Hopefully you have that in front of you. And we're going to be using the app Keynote. So I'm going to jump over to that now. And here is my Keynote ready to go. I've got into my themes and I'm going to simply present, bring up a white basic one. So I'll tap basic white and we're going to go into there. And immediately I'm just going to go through and delete everything off the slide. So as I tap once on each of the fields and delete, I'm left with just a blank slide, which is what I want. Now from here, and you would have noticed from my examples, they're all square. This is not square. So it's a little lesser known feature of Keynote. If I go into my 3-dot ellipsis up in the top corner here, and I'm going to come down to what's called Document Setup. And in Document Setup, I have two options across the bottom, Themes and Slide Size. I'm going to jump over to Slide Size, and I have, wouldn't you know it, an option for Square. And straight away, with done up in the top corner, I have a square slide. So immediately I have a piece, a blank template that is square ready to go. So I start with something as simple as a background. I'm going to hit the plus button up the top, and I'm going to, I'm going to tap the paintbrush and go to background, not the plus. And I might just go a straightforward color. Something bright, something orange, that will do just like that. I do need to have some text, so I'm going to tap that plus button and I'm going to go to my shapes, which is the third option across from the top. A lot of people do ask the question, where do I find shapes? Where do I find text in my shapes in Pages, Keynote, and Numbers? And it's in shapes, ironically. So if I jump back in here, it's always the very, very first shape. You'll see the word text. If I tap that, and there is my text box just there. All right, so I'm going to type in the I bet, this is my standard go-to here, bet you didn't no show. So I have a piece of text there. And of course I can tap the format button. I can muck around with its size, its font. I hold that down, make it nice and big. because I did say typeface should be nice and big, bold, and play around with the color. With 2 fingers, I could even tilt it a little bit if I want, and so on. So there's a fair bit that I can do here to make it look a little bit interesting. All right. Now, I don't want to spend too long playing around in here, but the idea being that we can add photos, pictures, and so on, so that we end up getting something that is a nice piece of artwork. But there's a really good little technique. I'm just going to digress a little bit here. A nice little technique when it comes to text. Traditionally, everyone puts all of their text in one text box. What I'm going to do is I'm going to break it apart. So I'm actually going to cut out that bottom line and I'm going to paste it again. So now I have 2 text boxes. And the reason for that is that students tend to, I guess typically when you say, let's put a heading in, everything's in one text box. And I guess what I'm trying to say is, we don't always have to think that way. Could I start playing around with the way that text is positioned and sort of start moving things around? Now I can see the word know and show, so maybe I might even take the word show out of here, cut that out, I'll paste it, and then now I have that there. I might even make that a little bit bigger. And of course I can play around with fonts, I can play around with all sorts here. Just bump that one right up and move that into there, sort of thing. So what ends up happening is we have a little bit of a change in the way that our text looks. So I guess that's probably a really key thing for me. We traditionally do text in text boxes and it looks like a text box. And to me, that's a little bit underwhelming. So I wonder if we can't break the text up and we position it and place it in different ways, it actually can start to look a lot more interesting. Finally, however, if I jump back into my Keynote document, I might just jump into adding a shape. I'll go to the magnifying glass up here and I'll type in mic. There's a microphone. I'll grab that and I'll pop that down here. And I could play around with that and do a few bits and pieces if I wish to. So I might just jump into style and I might just fill it with a different color just for now, something gray or whatever it might be. One little thing I could do here at this point, if I jump into format, into arrange, I have a button in here called break apart. It's right at the bottom there. If I break it apart, it actually segments the 2 separate pieces of the shape. Now you can't do that for every shape, but for where there are distinct separate parts, you can. So what I'm going to do, I'm thinking here, is I might make this base black and I might make the top part red. And so now I have a slightly different look. Of course, if I want to resize them, they're separate pieces. So I do need to regroup them. And I'm going to use one finger to hold the red. The other finger taps on another hand, taps the black, and then I can group them again if I wish. I might bring that up there. I might set my arrange to the back. And hey, I'm starting to play around. And so you can see that with a combination of shapes and color, and the best part is mucking around with text boxes to position them differently, things can start to look a little bit better. Finally though, I do have a picture. What will traditionally happen, people will take a screenshot. We can do better than that. We're going to tap the 3-dot ellipsis. We'll assume that it's all finished. You might even have a photo of yourself on there or someone on there. But we're going to jump, second option down is export. And you'll notice that second from the bottom is my option for images. And I can in here just export it as a picture, where I can then jump in here and go save image, which is this one here. And away it goes. Now I would find that picture in my camera roll. And so I can then use that picture as my artwork and it's done. So an easy way. Keynote, by the way, is just a magnificent tool for creating artwork for design. It's brilliant. So there was an easy example. Like I said, I didn't put a photo of myself in there, but hey, knock yourself out, go for it. All right. So when we look at our artwork, simple gradient backgrounds or a solid background, instant alpha around people, and big bold typeface. And as I mentioned before, muck around with those text boxes to make them look a little bit better. Let's jump over to recording and digital mechanics. So in here, I'm going to break this up into two parts. And this is where we're going to amp things up just a little bit as well. When we break it into two parts, the mechanics are that we have an intro music that we're going to record. So we're going to need to create some, something that's catchy that people can hear, obviously. And then the second one is recording our voice. So when we create intro music, I have a bit of a rule of thumb. And it's the 3 B's rule. It's my rule, 3 B's. And the 3 B's are a beat, a band instrument, and a bass. And if you want to, another embellishment. So I figure that we have 3 tracks and that the first track is a beat. We find a beat, then we find a band instrument. And when I say a band instrument, I'm thinking, guitar, keyboard, some strings, whatever it might be. And then a bass line as well. That's the third one. Now the embellishment is an extra if you want to. And that could be simply something like a triangle or maracas or a bongo drum or just some sort of little, fluffy thing in the background that just sort of adds a fourth dimension to it. But those 3 B's are the key thing here. So, all right. So what we're going to do is we're going to start creating that sort of project. So let's jump into our iPad. I'm going to jump into GarageBand here, into something that I've prepared earlier. So this is the end result of what we're going to create. We're going to create 3 separate tracks, and then we're going to, place them in that order. So to do so, we're going to, in GarageBand, I'm going to jump in here and I'm going to create a brand new project. I'm in my tracks view. Now I could probably pick any one of these categories. However, I just always typically start with audio recorder. I find it the easiest. Now in here, sure, this is where I'd want to go if I want to start recording my voice, but I'm not at that point yet. First thing I'm going to do up the top in blue is the metronome right next to my volume slider. I'm going to tap that and turn it white, and that turns it off. The next thing is I want to jump over to my tracks view. Now if I look in my top left corner, I have a few buttons. The first is like a page with a folded over corner. Then I move over to there's 3 boxes, a big box in the middle with 2 smaller ones on the outside. And then the third one across looks a bit like a brick wall, I suppose. That's the tracks view, and that's the one that I want to go into. It'll change to a microphone and it brings up all my tracks options. Now, this next point is probably the most key point when using GarageBand for podcasting. You see, the thing is, and I've seen this so many times, you'll create the most amazing recording and then realize it hasn't recorded. GarageBand by default, if you have a look at the tracks, it runs for 8 bars. If you look at the numbers across the top. When a recording hits the end of those 8 bars, it will stop. You can create extra sections, but it will stop. What we need is for GarageBand to record infinitely. And this is super important. So at the end of those numbers, there is a little plus button, which I'll tap. In here is a few options. Section A, 8 bars. If I tap that, I'll see an option for automatic. I need to turn that on. Then I can just tap out. The big difference here is now that when the recording gets to the end of those 8 bars, it actually doesn't matter anymore. It will just keep recording. It's so important to remember to turn that on. I've seen it so many times. So let's create a few of our bits and pieces here. First of all, up in the top right-hand corner, there are 3 buttons, starting with a question mark from the right. Moving left, there is a cog for settings, and then we have a loop. So like a loop-to-loop thing there. So we're going to tap on that, which are our loops. Now I said we wanted a beat. So to kick off with, I could just go and search through all of my loops here, bearing in mind, what's a loop? Loop is a sound bite or a soundtrack, a small piece of music where its beginning and its end match so that it can keep cycling over and over and over again, and it will just infinitely sound like it's seamless. That's what a loop is. So we need to find a beat loop that suits. And like I said, I could go through all of my loops here and I'll be here forever trying to find it. So I could start going through, up the top here, I have instruments. I might single out some loops that I like for a beat in here. Or I might go to the word genres. And if I tap on that, these are different styles that I might find of sound. And then finally descriptors, which describe the kind of music. So I'm going to go back to my instruments, and I could go into, say, even all drums, and I could scroll through all my drums and find what I want. Now I know what I want. So for you, you might be sitting there searching, and you can pause the video and have a bit of a play. For me though, for my demo, I use one called After Hours Beat. And if I search that one, there it is there. I'm going to grab this one and place it in the second track. In fact, I've placed it under the microphone. Now I've done that intentionally. It's going to become its own track. I actually don't want that microphone anymore, that track at the top there. So I'm going to tap the microphone just once, and then once more, I'll find delete and get rid of it. So now I just have that beat. If I hit play, great. I can hear that there is a beat playing there in the background. So that's my beat. Now I want another track, which is my band instrument. Again, I could go through my instruments. I could go to guitars or synths or strings, piano. It's endless. But I could go into my search because I know what I want, and it's called Around the Block. I'll search that one up. Around the Block Guitar Plucks 1, and I'm going to place that there as well. I know that's what I want. And then finally, there is a loop that I want, which I know is called Hot Pursuit Bass 3. I'll find that one. Maybe I need to learn how to spell pursuit. There it is. And I'll pop that there. Now I've got my 3 tracks. All right, fantastic. Now I know I did that really quick, and I know that I'm armed here with the information that I need to get those 3 tracks. But for you, this is where you would be pausing videos and having a bit of a deep dive into the different loops that are there. The problem with choosing loops, and I often say this to classes, is that picking a loop is a bit like picking a font. You'll be there for hours trying to find the right one, and then eventually you'll just sort of settle on one. So sometimes it's worth just picking something to play with, and then you can always go back and sort of dive a little bit deeper. But for the purposes of play, just sort of choose something. It may not even sound great, but at least you've got something to play with. So with my 3 tracks now in place, I now need to start considering how my voice is going to work over the top of them. And the problem I have is that if I just let those tracks play, they're going to be a little bit too loud. So I need to start playing around with volumes, and so the interaction with my voice, it sounds a little bit better. So here's my 3 tracks. And the first thing I want to do is I'm going to bring them all together. I'm actually going to merge them together. So I'm going to tap the icon of the top one and tap it once more, and I get my menu, delete, duplicate, rename, merge. There's the merge button. If I tap merge, I can select all of them, and then in the top right hand corner I have the word merge, and it's done. Okay, so all of those 3 tracks are now combined into one. But I need to get my voice recorded. In the very bottom left corner is a plus button. I'm going to tap that plus. I get to choose what am I going to add here, and obviously it's going to be an audio recorder. So I'll tap audio recorder. And there's a few options here that I can play with. So if I was to tap on clean, I can change in here. I might want to go to vocals. I might choose something like lead vocals, or I might choose narrator, or I might choose radio ready. Now that's the one I'm going to stop on, radio ready. I'll tap done. On the left-hand side, you'll notice that as I'm talking, I've got the little bouncing green line. It's saying, yep, I understand, I can hear you, and I'm recording, and these are the levels. On the right-hand side, you'll notice the term monitor, and it's off. And that's a really handy one for listening to as you record. So things like headphones play a role here. For now, I'm not going to worry about those things. Incidentally, above that picture of the microphone is the word fun. If I wanted to jump in here and change it to a different character, again, I can do that. I don't want to do that, but I can if I want to. All right, so I need to do some recording. So the problem I have before I hit this record button is if I record, I'm actually going to hear my music play at the same time. So here is a problem. My music playing as I'm recording can be quite a distraction. So in actual fact, I'm going to go back to my tracks view. I'm just going to come out here and I'm going to tap mute on my music, that little speaker with the line through it. I'm going to tap mute, and by doing that, I won't hear it. It's not going away. It's just not a distraction. All right, my radio ready mic, it's still there. It's still working away. So I'm going to press record, and I'm going to record a little intro. Hello and welcome to the I Bet You Didn't Know show, a podcast where we talk about all things that I bet you didn't know. Okay, so there's a little bit of dialogue of me recording. If I tap back on that tracks view, you'll get very comfortable flicking between tracks view and the microphone view, and you'll notice there is my intro right there. Now, if I was to play this, you'll notice that I'll unmute the music. Hello and welcome to the I Bet You Didn't Know show. Okay, so volumes here are a real problem. You can't clearly hear me. We need to play around. So I'm going to explain something here, and I'm going to warn you with a little safety cone that what I'm about to explain does tend to sort of step up the complication a little bit. It is all about volumes. So this hopefully will explain and make life a little bit easier. So this is a little graph. On the left-hand side, we've got our volume level. Running across the bottom is the length of time. And if I was to look at the normal volume as 0, there it is, just a line of volume. That's it. It's just running across. But what happens is we introduce a block of dialogue. I've called it intro/covering. And that's that green block there. So the volume is running along. What we're going to want to do is we want to duck the volume of the music. So to do that, I'm going to have a look at where my intro starts, and I'm going to put in something what I tend to call a pivot point. Call it a keyframe, but for a better term, I'll use the term pivot point. I'm going to put one on the outside of that line, imaginary red dotted line. And I'm going to put one on the other side as well. And then at the other end, I'm going to do exactly the same thing. And then with that, I can drag down my volume so that my pivot points allow the volume to drop and then come back up. What does it do? It means the music is ducking while I'm talking, and I'm doing this all manually. And then finally, I might do the same down the other end where I then start talking about and talking through my podcast. How do I do this? I do this through a process called automation. So, okay. Going to do this on my iPad. Hopefully, again, you can hit the pause button and play along. Here's the file. I've got my music on the top. I've got my voice at the bottom. And I'm going to bring this across. I'm just tapping and dragging left and right. And I'm going to say about here, I'm only guessing for now, that this is where I want to have the voice start. So I've got my playhead here. I'll just move that out the way. Now, this automation thing, how do we get it? Well, I'll just close this up here because I can get a bit more screen space there. Bring that over. All right. I'm going to tap on one of the icons, and where we saw merge before, just to the right of that is the word automation. If I tap automation, I get an expanded version of my tracks. Now, rookie mistake, we'll start tapping all over it and nothing will happen, because in the very top left corner is a slide lock. So it's actually on the pencil at the minute. I'm going to just drag it across. It will go red, and it means I can now play around with it and make it active. It just stops you from making mistakes and errors. So I said before on my music track, I want to put in these dots, these imaginary dots, before I start talking and after I've started talking. There's two there. I'm just tapping before I start talking and after, before I finish and then afterwards. So by putting in those pivot points, I can now drag, whoops, I'll undo that. I'll drag down my pivot points so that my volume drops. All right, let's have a little bit of a look here. If I tap done, I should be able to play this. Hello and welcome to the I Bet You. All right, and so we can see that the volume of the music drops while I'm talking. That's all done through automation using keyframes. Like I said, I call them pivot points. So that's a really, really key part in this whole process. So now that we've got a file we can play with, we might explore a little bit more about putting some more content into our podcast. So if I jump back over here, we're talking about recording our voice. And this is something that I have covered a little bit already, is that jumping between your microphone view and your tracks view, it's something that you're going to need to do a fair bit of. And the more you play with it, the more comfortable you'll get knowing that there are different screens to manipulate and work with. But earlier in this workshop, I covered the run sheet, and I want to draw a connection of that run sheet to, say, a staircase. You see, the thing is, we could just have one single track, like I have in my example here. I have one single track of recording and just keep recording end after end after end. I could do that. But things can sort of sometimes go a little bit wrong. If we have everything in one track and we want to adjust something over here, it might affect something over here, and it sort of tends to become a little bit messy. The best thing we can do is separate them out into their own tracks. So if I come back to this idea of this run sheet, I have my 5 areas, and like I said, I like to think of it as a bit like a staircase. And so if I have that staircase, I could sort of, I guess, put those 5 areas into GarageBand, and then we spread them out, and it starts to look a little bit more like, I guess, something that's filled out in GarageBand where everything has its own track. So where I kept pressing that plus button in the bottom left-hand corner, I added a microphone for my intro. I would then press another plus button and I'd add another track for my discussion points. Press the plus button again, add another track for my wrap up, and so on. And I would keep adding all the different tracks. So having those multiple tracks, it just means you've got a bit more clarity over what's where, and it makes your podcast, it's going to sound the same, but it's going to be a whole lot easier to manipulate if you want to make some changes and edits and so on. So what I'm going to do is, just for a moment, I'm going to put up a script, and it will look like this. Now I'm going to be quiet for a second. I'm going to let you pause, and this is a script you can use to practice with. And I'll just hold it here for about 10 seconds. Okay, so having that script, hopefully you can then play around with that little, that basic idea, and start adding tracks and then seeing how you go by adding some more to your GarageBand, and eventually you get yourself a really cool recording. So a couple of things. How do we get this podcast that I've recorded out and as a file that I can use? Pretty simple to do. I'll jump back over to here. Now, of course, I haven't got all of my recordings here. That's something for you to do. So for me, I'm going to assume that I am finished here. In the very top left corner, I'm going to tap that page, and here I know it was called My Song. So I'm going to grab this one, tap and hold, and I get an option for sharing. It's the very bottom option over here. So I'm going to tap share, and I get 3 options: a song, a ringtone, and a project. Well, project, not so much, but I am just going to call out the idea of saving it as a project. If you wanted to push it further and push this project to GarageBand on a Mac, you can then probably play with it to another level if you wish. So that's why project is a really, really good option. Ringtone, a lot of people see this and go, whoa, I didn't know I could make a ringtone. Yes, you can. But obviously we're going to do a song. The irony in all of this is that we're not actually doing a song, we're doing a podcast, but we're going to choose song. In here, we might just change some settings if we need to. So, high quality is good. Change some details if you want, and I'll go share. And then when I tap share, this is where I get to put it into some particular places. And honestly, I'm probably just going to save it as a file to a location. All right. So let's close that one out. Okay. So the second part of this is hardware. So if I wanted to think about, well, what equipment am I actually using? So if I jump over to here into hardware, there's a few bits and pieces that I can I guess, dabble with and use to record with. Now, at the very first, I can just use my iPad. I can record straight into that. It's got a really good microphone. Ironically, people still think the microphone's at the bottom like their phone. It's not. It's at the top, at the back. Sometimes it's near the little camera. Other times it's in the center, depending on the model of your iPad. So if you're talking directly into your iPad, talk to the back of it at the top, not the bottom like a phone. But there's a few other pieces of hardware that I like to use. And if I flick over to this camera here, I've got a few bits and pieces. And probably one of the first ones I'll start with, if I bring my hands in here, is a little Rode mic. Now, I like Rode mics. I have a few of them here. So I'll point this one out. This one here is a Rode Mobile Me L for Lightning. And this one, it's a little bit beaten up because it lives in my pencil case. That's why it's a bit scratched, but we'll pretend that it looks nice and new and fancy. And that one there is a fantastic little microphone for putting on the bottom of an iPad or even your phone. It's directional and it's going to give a lot clearer sound to someone who's closer. So they're really, really good. They're somewhere in the order of just over $100 each. Come with a little dead cat as well. So if you want to keep the wind out, you can do. But this is where things get a little bit more interesting. So we can step it up a little bit more. We can get a little bit of an external microphone happening here. And then we can get up into something even bigger, which is a USB microphone. Now, what it's worth knowing is that whilst this is a USB mic, you can plug USB microphones directly into an iPad. However, depending on the microphone, sometimes microphones require more power than what an iPad can deliver. Your iPad will spit out a little warning saying it can't power it. So just bear that in mind. So you can use USB microphones. They are great. They're nice and clear. But depending on the amount of power it draws and requires, it might not let you. Just bear that one in mind. Which leads me on to this one. Now, my normal Rode kit consists of a couple of these podcasting mics here. They are fantastic little mics, but they are XLR mics. They're not USB, so they're very manual. So how does that help me? Well, I use those in conjunction with one of these guys here. So this is a USB interface where I can plug a couple of microphones. Well, let me get my fingers in the right spot. A couple of microphones in here and this USB's into my iPad and it will work. The trick here though is, and I've seen this little mistake as well, people will buy one of these to use and there are smaller versions. And again, like a USB microphone, they are powered by USB. Now, if I'm talking jargon to you, I apologize, but if you can keep with me, the smaller ones that are powered by USB, again, your iPad will say, I can't run it. This one, however, has its own power supply. And that's actually really important. I know this might seem like a strange thing to bring up, but it's actually really important because I'd hate for someone to go out and buy something and realize they can't use it. Having one that has its own power supply means you can plug this into the wall. The USB is irrelevant. It will just do its own thing. So it will then basically work like you can plug a couple of microphones into this and it doesn't require the power from your iPad. So it will work fine. So I guess in short, if you happen to buy a USB interface like this, make sure it's got its own power supply. That's it. The smaller ones don't. That's really, really important. So between that and again, using some really nice podcasting mics if you want to get some really good quality sound. Like I said, USB mics are really, really good as well. But even if you want to just bring it down a whole level, these little Mobile Me mics are fantastic as well. And it probably doesn't go without saying, decent headphones are actually a really important part too. They make a huge difference. If I get that in the middle there, a huge difference as well. So having the right equipment is really, really important. So when it comes to hardware for your equipment plugging into your iPad, there is one other little consideration to make. And as silly as it sounds, it's all to do with the plug that actually goes into your iPad. You see, traditionally, a headphone plug, which if I bring up the right screen here, a headphone plug has what we call a tip, ring, and a sleeve, TRS. It has 3 silver bands generally. And that's simply because headphones have left, right, so one of them is left, one of them is right, and then the third is just a common that brings it all back together. And that's fine for normal headphones. But when an iPad, for the purposes of using a microphone, has an extra ring on it. So we call that a TRRS plug or TRRS plug. And that extra ring, that's the microphone and allows it to work. So it's really important to understand that sometimes people plug a TRS plug into their iPad and it doesn't quite work in the way that they'd sort of hoped. It doesn't sound right, or it hasn't recorded right, or it just isn't right. So I guess for the purposes of this is simply saying, when you use plugs in your iPad, just be aware that an iPad is a TRRS socket. So it's looking for 4 rings to work the best. So that said, if you go and plug something else in there, like a traditional headphone jack, it may not work the right way. So how do you get around it? You can just buy an adapter, TRS to TRRS. So a simple eBay search, or even Rode make them as well, that you can get, and they're just a little cable that jumps in between the two. That's all it is. Okay, so the final thing, publishing. This is how do we get our podcast up onto the web so that people can hear. So there are a couple of platforms that you can use, and a really common one is Anchor, which isn't a bad one. In fact, there's an app for it, and it works really, really well. And the other one, which is actually more my go-to, is Podbean. And if I was to break the two down, Anchor does embed ads, and you can, I think it does call for monetization pledges, so on. It keeps it free. It is app-based, which I do like, and it does have that built-in structure for recording. Podbean, on the flip side, has an education sign-up, which is free, but it's limited to 3 publications per day and a total of 5 hours of recording space. And it does aggregate to all popular platforms. So if you do want to go outside just Apple Podcasts, you can if you wish. The 3 publications a day is also, it's not a deal breaker either. Very rarely would you want to be pushing out more than 3 podcasts in one day. So I actually have found, in all my use, I've never found that to be a sticking point. So how do we make it happen? So there's kind of 3 steps to this. The first part is this: you sign up with an aggregator. So Podbean is what we call an aggregator. It's where we can put all our content, and it does the job of pushing it out to platforms to be able to hear it. So we're going to sign up with an aggregator called, like in my case, I use one called Podbean. And I create a podcasting channel on that. So create that simple sign up. So in Podbean, I'm going to need to put in 3 files. So once I've got my channel up and running on there, and you can play around with Podbean if you wanted to and have a bit of an explore, I need 3 things. I'm going to need my audio file from GarageBand. I'm going to need a really short blurb of text that describes it. And then I'm going to need that artwork, which we did right at the start. So those 3 things make up a really good podcast. The second part, I need to register with what's called Podcast Connect. Now, this is where things can get a little bit tricky. So I'm going to go podcastconnect.apple.com. And in here, I'm going to use an Apple ID to create the account. It's worth knowing here that if your school uses managed Apple IDs, you can't use a managed Apple ID for creating podcast accounts. So it has to be a non-managed Apple ID. That's very important. So we create that Podcast Connect account. So beyond that, we jump over to here. This is where things get a little bit tricky. So from Podbean, we're going to need to find what's called the RSS feed. So that's the feed that allows Podbean to then send it over to podcasts, Apple Podcasts. So we're basically going to find it. You can find it if you look through your Podbean. If you're using it, you'll find that link. And then you're just going to simply copy it and paste it into Podcast Connect. I've got that little asterisk there that says it can take up to 24 hours for a channel to go live. So don't do it thinking that it's going to go live straight away. There is a bit of a process that happens in behind it. And that RSS feed, so it looks a little like this. I take it from Podbean. It's a really big, long, ugly link. That was an example of one before, and I jumped into Podcast Connect and I paste it in there. Beyond that, step 3, we're going to locate the podcast URL. So in my Apple Podcasts, I find my podcast. It's got its own URL, its own link, and I've got to paste that back into Podbean. And that ensures that everything's valid. So by doing that, it makes it work. You can just double check your validity. I've got a little website down there, podba.se/validate. And if you put your link in that, it will just do some cross-checking and make sure it all works and is okay. But at the end of the day, if you go to Apple Podcasts and you find a search and you find it, or you put the link in there and it works, bingo, it's good to go. So it's a nice one that way. I know I whipped through that pretty quickly and it seemed probably almost too simple, but I promise you it's something you would probably need to invest a little bit of time into. Getting yourself, excuse me, organized into Podbean is actually really quite simple. Create an account, create your channel, put your content in there, done. It's just getting your podcast connect bit right and then making the two talk to each other. That bit is a bit, it takes a bit of time and a bit of patience. So I do encourage you to have a go, but just be patient with it to see that it will work. So across all of that though, hopefully you've got a bit of an idea of recording your podcast using GarageBand and using different tracks to be able to lay it all out, and obviously with your music and making that all sort of sound good, and automation to make the volume sound a little bit good. Understanding the different kinds of microphones and hardware is really, really important as well. And then finally, being able to get it up online. And that to me is the best bit, because if you can get it up online, it makes it real, especially for students as well. So beyond that, there's a few resources to call out. One being that the Everyone Can Create resources that exist, which you can find in Apple Books, or even go to the Apple Teacher site, appleteacher.apple.com. And within there is a ton of stuff to have a look and play around with. And a lot of what you can find we've been doing, you can see within the Everyone Can Create music, which ties very, very closely to what we've been doing in GarageBand. Again, as I mentioned, appleteacher.apple.com has a ton of stuff where you can, I guess, build your capacity and understanding of using the technology with your students. So it's a really, really good one. I absolutely encourage you to check it out. But finally, is just my little contact details. Again, if you ever feel like you want to reach out, ask a question, hey Matt, I watched this workshop and I'm a little bit confused about please do sing out. Don't hesitate to reach out that way. But I hope after all of that, you've learned something new. You've got some ideas. You've probably left you with more questions than anything, but the best thing to do is just go and have a bit of a play, and you'll sort of start to see it all fit together. Good luck with it, and I hope to see your podcast up on podcasts one day. Good luck.